Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast titled Building Resilience in Partnership with Vulnerable Communities. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Watershed Academy and EPA's Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, also known as OWOW. I'm Miranda Chen-Hale with EPA's Watershed Academy, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Thank you all for joining us today. We will start by going over a few housekeeping items. First, I would like to briefly summarize some of the features of today's webcast. We hope you will have a lot of questions. Please type your question in the chat questions panel on your GoToWebinar control panel and click the send icon. If you have any problems viewing the broadcast, just let us know in that same box and we will post an answer. The webcast will be archived for later viewing on EPA's Watershed Academy webcast page at www.epa.gov/watershedacademy. Participants are eligible to receive a certificate for their attendance at the end of the webcast. Directions for obtaining the certificate will be presented at the conclusion of the presentations. The materials in this webcast have been reviewed by U.S. EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of U.S. EPA. Mention of commercial enterprises, products, or publications does not mean that U.S. EPA endorses them. Now that we have completed the discussion of housekeeping items, let's kick off today's webcast. This webcast will present the environmental justice factors that contribute to vulnerability and provide examples of how EPA and its partner programs have effectively worked to help build resilience with vulnerable communities. We will explore how the Urban Waters Partnership model can build networks of resilience and introduce other user-friendly tools and resources that help support resilience. Let me introduce our panel of highly esteemed speakers. Today, we will hear from Janine Finley. Janine is a program analyst in the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA headquarters, where she focuses on strategic partnerships for environmental justice and water equity. She is trained as a natural and social scientist with a BS in biology from Howard University and an MA in global environmental policy with a focus on equity and water governance from American University. Second, we'll have Brenda Torres. Brenda serves as Executive Director of the San Juan Bay Estuary Program, a national program focused on the restoration of water bodies in the metropolitan area of Puerto Rico. She is the founder of the Latino Climate Action Network and has led the community revitalization effort in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, through a comprehensive program called the Green Light District. Brenda received a BS in Environmental Sciences from University of Puerto Rico and a master's degree in Environmental Management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Third, we'll have Tom Herter. Tom is in his 12th year at the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program, where he is the Watershed Protection Coordinator. A Marine veteran with bachelor's and master's degree in marine biology from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and having completed coursework towards a PhD in zoology from the University of Florida. He has a strong science background, particularly in estuarine biology. Lastly, we'll have Melissa Diaz. Melissa is a climate program analyst at the District Department of Energy and Environment, where she focuses on climate adaptation and resilience. Much of her research is centered on how climate resilience can support and be a part of a larger strategy to address equity. She is also interested in finding creative ways to integrate climate considerations into a wide range of decision-making practices. Prior to her role at DOEE, she worked on climate adaptation at Georgetown Climate Center and the Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. One final note before we kick off the presentations. We will try to answer as many questions as possible during our question and answer sessions on today's webcast. However, due to a high number of participants, not all questions will be answered, so please do contact speakers after the webcast if you still want to follow up. The speaker's contact information is on one of our final slides. And with that, we'll begin our presentation. I will now turn it over to Janine to provide an introduction of today's webinar. Janine, the floor is yours.
Okay. Am I up? Did it work? Thank you so much, Miranda. Am I good? Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Miranda. I really appreciate that. And really appreciate everybody tuning in today for this presentation. So I'm going to just start off by kind of giving us a little bit of the lay of the land for why we're here today. Is this box showing up? Okay. It's not clicking forward. Can I just hit the exit for this? Now it's working. Okay, apologies. I'm just going to start off by just sort of defining kind of what resilience is. And there's lots of different definitions for resilience, and this was the most, I think, straightforward and simple one that I could find. And really it's the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, and recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. And so obviously there's many different types of extreme events that happen, and with a changing climate, we know that there's even more and more extreme events that are taking place, it seems, every year. This presentation, we're going to be focusing on extreme events, basically flooding, extreme precipitation, hurricanes, and so obviously we're not going to be covering all of these major events, and we're going to be focusing on the eastern portion of the country, and you're going to hear some examples from Puerto Rico, you're going to hear some examples from Alabama, but we don't want to obviously give the impression that these are the only extreme events that are happening. This is just the scope of this presentation. So this is just an example of some of the extreme events that we've seen, especially the most expensive ones that we've seen in the past couple of years. Really great diagram from NOAA, and it really just gives you an idea of the extreme events that we see: major hurricanes, major storms, and in other parts of the country, droughts. So this is a really important topic, and especially talking about communities that are the most impacted. And so I just wanted to really quickly kind of give you guys some resources that I use for this presentation. So the first one is from the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Really great report that I'm going to be referencing a lot. And the report really goes over a framework to understand vulnerability, which I'm going to go over throughout the presentation. Another really great report that I'm going to be referencing is from the U.S. Water Alliance, and it's called An Equitable Water Future, and really focuses on some of the major water equity challenges that we see around the U.S. and also includes really great case studies. So these are just some examples of really great resources that are available on this topic. So I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about how we understand vulnerability. And vulnerability is defined through three major elements, and the first is exposure. So exposure is contact between a person or one or more biological, psychosocial, chemical, or physical stressors, including stressors that are impacted by climate change. And so this is a diagram from that first report that I mentioned, and it focuses on some of the human health impacts of climate change. That's why you see those boxes at the bottom. The second major element of vulnerability and how we define it has to do with sensitivity. And so the sensitivity is the degree to which people or communities are affected either adversely or beneficially by climate vulnerability. And so within sensitivity, we also understand that the social determinants of health is really important. And so social determinants of health is defined as groups that are disproportionately disadvantaged by social determinants that limit resources and opportunities for health-promoting behaviors and health-promoting conditions in day-to-day life. So this could include, for example, the conditions that someone is living or working in, or their access to healthcare. All that might impact exactly sort of how their health outcomes turn out. And social determinants of health interact with all three of these elements of vulnerability in different ways. It contributes to increased exposure, increased sensitivity, and also can contribute to reduced adaptive capacity. And so the third element that I just mentioned, adaptive capacity, is the ability of a community, institution, or just an everyday individual to adjust to potential hazards and to take advantage of opportunities to respond to the consequences of extreme events. And so, what we see, like a real world example is, if someone is not able to adapt because they can't actually get out of the way of a storm, for example. We find that people that are low income or are dealing with financial stress often cannot evacuate when a disaster is on its way. So that's just an example of adaptive capacity. it also has to do with social cohesion and your community infrastructure, access to resources, things like that. And so the other element of this, and I know that we, when we talk about vulnerability, we get into a bit of complexity and especially when we're talking about, human behavior and social systems. And so, but we do have to think through kind of, vulnerability happens at different scales as well. So at the individual and family scale, we talked a little bit about the social determinants of health. That impacts at the community scale as well, but then we also have what does the natural and built environment look like, what's the status of that environment, and the cohesion of your community, the social capital, which is your access to resources, access to networks within your community that can help you adapt and become more resilient. In addition, another scale that we can talk about is at the state and local scale, where natural resource management institutions for emergency preparedness are taking place. We could also even add a regional scale to this. It's not on this particular slide, but we can talk about the regional scale where, basin level management decisions are made. And then at the country and society scale, we're looking at broader governance and institutions for our natural and built environment. And so vulnerability really puts pressure at all these different levels. And so, we see these outcomes play out at the individual and community. That's usually where we see after a major event, a negative outcome or an outcome that we wouldn't like to see at the community level or the individual level, but all of these kind of drivers of vulnerability are happening at different scales. Now I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit through this diagram. Like I said in the beginning, it came from, I got this diagram from the U.S. Global Change Research Programs report. And this diagram is great because just circling back to talking about, vulnerability, it really gives you an understanding of the social and behavioral context. So the vulnerability drivers there and your environmental and institutional context. As well. And so really the climate drivers are kind of acting upon both of those contexts. And then that's what's kind of giving us the outcomes that we see. So once again, it can get a little bit complex, but when we're talking about human beings and human systems and societies, we have to embrace complexity a little bit. So, but this is a really great diagram to help us kind of conceptually understand like how vulnerability comes into play at all levels of our lives. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some specific examples. And so, most recently in the past couple of years, we've seen some major hurricanes. Some of our speakers are going to talk through their particular experiences and their approaches. But, just one example that we've seen, with, for example, Hurricane Harvey that struck Houston, extensive flooding all throughout Houston. But the impact of that flooding wasn't equally distributed. We found that wealthier portions of the city were able to, build in resiliency through like flood safeguards, whether they were dikes and berms but unfortunately, in some areas where public housing was actually built, public housing for low-income families was actually built in low-lying areas, and there were not safeguards in place for those communities. And so, there's lots of reasons why this happens, and so it's just important for us to think through why we talked about the whole framework for vulnerability, like how this actually takes place, but then also some approaches to addressing it. So we are looking right now at a similar diagram to the one that I showed, but specifically talking about the vulnerability drivers as they relate to flooding. And so as you can see, your social and behavioral context is what's going on in your community, what's going on in your family, what is your health, what is your ability to connect to broader resources and institutions that would be able to support you. But then in addition, your environmental and institutional context has to do with what's the state of the infrastructure, where's your community located, and so some of the ways that vulnerability comes into play when a flooding event happens. So in particular, we all know that infrastructure is extremely important. It helps us build resiliency when an extreme event happens, especially floods. But the impact of the loss of infrastructure is extensive. Public services are disrupted that people rely on and need, and especially when there are events that happen in succession that can create an even worse situation. So for example, if the infrastructure is already degraded where you live, or it isn't meeting the needs of being able to manage a huge flooding event or a huge precipitation event, then people are in an even more perilous situation. In addition, we typically learn about water quality and how water can become a hazard when runoff is introduced into the water, and that can be from agriculture, that can be from urban runoff, but in particular, when we think about communities that are the most vulnerable, and this is a really great diagram that I was able to find that was published on the City Lab website, but this is a really great example in the Hurricane Florence situation, where in North Carolina specifically, and also parts of South Carolina, we have some historic environmental justice communities that are sited near some specific hazards. And part of the reason why these communities have been sort of trying to bring this issue to the fore in terms of where they live and the risks around the siting of different toxic facilities around their communities is because in a particular situation of an extreme event like a hurricane, the risk is even greater. And so the great thing about this diagram is it kind of overlays the rainfall totals that occurred in Hurricane Florence with some of those hazards around different communities. And the bottom photograph was a photo that was collected by the Waterkeeper Alliance in North Carolina, and so they took some photos of a hog farm, and so that's what you can see is some of the contamination from a hog farm that happened in the subsequent flooding after that hurricane. And obviously, water flows, so the picture isn't extremely simple in terms of where that water is going to flow to, but the siting of these sites is definitely something that is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about vulnerable communities. So basically, to kind of wrap up this introduction, the major takeaways that I just wanted to kind of frame this discussion, have to do with some of the patterns that we see. And so, we find that low-income communities have a higher tendency to be sited in low-lying areas or near bodies of water. Frequent flooding can damage homes, and if your infrastructure is already degraded, obviously that creates even other public health risks. Vulnerable communities, they may not have sufficient infrastructure to deal with stormwater or even wastewater infrastructure, like we see in some parts of Lowndes County, Alabama, for example, where wastewater infrastructure in a rural community, wastewater infrastructure is actually pretty much non-existent. And so, so these are patterns that we see in terms of the degraded infrastructure also in vulnerable communities. Another pattern is disinvested urban neighborhoods sometimes have concentrations of impervious surfaces. And so these are really place-specific challenges. And so this is one reason why I put up the Louisville Urban Heat Management Study, because it was a very specific study that was done that looked at the intersection between urban heat and impervious surfaces, and did find a connection to that being mostly concentrated in low-income communities. But obviously, every single place is different, and so your analysis has to take all of those, all of the context, your local context, into play. And so, the last piece that I'll just mention is just that vulnerable communities don't always receive the aid and the relief funding that they need to recover from events. So all of these issues kind of come into play when we're thinking about resiliency around flooding and hurricanes and heavy precipitation events. And then I'll, just close out by kind of giving you guys this, classic picture that I think everybody's seen, but just kind of gives you the difference between equality, equity, and justice. And so that's why we're here today, to kind of talk about, what are these great approaches that some of our colleagues have put in place, and they're going to talk to you about today to kind of address and hopefully help build resiliency in the communities that need it the most. So I'll just close with that. And I think that we can see if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Janine. We'll pause just for a moment to see if any questions come in, but in the meantime, would you talk a little bit about EPA's role and your office's role during some of the most recent natural disasters?
So that's a good question. What we've learned, especially recently, is that really since I think Hurricane Katrina, and even before that, with other major events that have happened, that this is a really important issue. And the communities that are the most vulnerable, there's a lot more, I think, awareness around inequities that come into play. And so folks in my office have been working closely with our emergency management office. And so we have an Office of Land and Emergency Management at EPA, and EPA has a specific role when it comes to responding to a disaster. And so what we've been working to do, and my colleague Victoria Robinson has been leading this, but what we've been working to do is really work through those structures and those processes of how EPA responds, the role that EPA plays in a response, and making sure that there's an environmental justice coordinator, a community involvement, a community liaison coordinator role that is a part of that process, to make sure that we're able to understand where the major impact is happening, especially with communities that may have a harder time connecting with resources. So that's been a major part of what my colleague Victoria Robinson has been leading.
Okay, I think we'll leave that for now. I'll let you introduce the next speakers.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brenda Torres. Brenda Torres is with the San Juan Bay Estuary Program, and she's going to be discussing some of the great work that they've been doing in Puerto Rico after Maria. So I'll turn it over to Brenda.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone see the screen? Okay. So my name is Brenda Torres. I'm the Executive Director of the San Juan Bay Estuary Program. I'm really glad to get this invitation from the Urban Waters Program, as well as from the Watershed Academy. It's actually an honor to be presenting on the environmental justice and disaster resilience in the San Juan Bay Estuary system. Yeah, so everyone knows where Puerto Rico is located, in the Caribbean basin, and we'll be actually talking more specifically about the vulnerability aspects that we face here in Puerto Rico. And this is just a map of the areas where the brownfield properties, Superfund sites, and flood-prone areas are, just to alert us on the potential problems and the actual vulnerability that Puerto Rico is currently. That is without the human factor, right? Without the demographic information. But in reality, we have an area where more than half of the population lives under the poverty line. We do have a very unreliable and expensive electricity service, definitely lack of safe water, and a high unemployment rate. Definitely is a problem that we are trying to integrate into the watershed management projects that we have. But more specifically, I'm going to talk about the metropolitan region and the San Juan Bay Estuary watershed, the area of study of our program. And you can see here the circle, the yellow circle, that's an area that is, the red one is the developed areas, and areas that are pretty much also flood-prone areas as well. The San Juan Bay Estuary watershed, it's approximately 97 square miles. It covers 8 municipalities and it's 17 miles long. It's a very urbanized area and an area that where around 600,000 people currently live. Before Maria, I just wanted to show this just so you see what we were facing prior to this hurricane that hit us last year. We were facing the longest economic recession we faced, and really that acted as a barrier for the government to invest in infrastructure development and retrofit of the current infrastructure. The fact that we were also facing an exodus of our population really made the things worse for the government. When Maria hit us, we had lost approximately 13% of the population, considering the census of 2010 and 2016. Now on September 20th, Hurricane Maria made landfall as a Category 4 storm with more than 155 miles per hour of wind speed. It is really the strongest hurricane that has ever hit us in 80 years. The storm caused nearly complete devastation, including the catastrophic failure of the island's power grid, water and wastewater infrastructure, and communication networks. The economy of the island ground to a halt in the face of physical damages, loss of supporting infrastructure, and the absence of power and water. When we were faced by this disaster and catastrophic event, we at the San Juan Bay Estuary Program quickly put together a relief campaign that was born actually out of our climate change adaptation plan that we had put together several years prior to Maria. And then from there, develop various support efforts based on 4 areas of concern. The first one was the infrastructure support, green and gray infrastructure, environmental evaluation, community support, and Friends of the Condado Lagoon, which is a network to support the only nature reserve that the San Juan Bay National Estuary Program co-manage with the Department of Natural Resources. We not only work within our watershed, but we also supported other regions, remote regions that needed the support, the protocols, the resources, the equipment, the solar systems that we had in these other areas where Vieques, a remote island on the eastern coast of Puerto Rico, Humacao, were actually the hurricane made landfall, and the eastern side of the municipality of Loíza. Through that work, we were able to deploy 3 desalination plants to provide clean drinking water to the residents that did not have access to it. We installed 22 solar panels in 2 systems, and distributed water filters, around 500 of them. We also provided other community support, such as Movie Under the Stars, and for that we actually had a couple of viewings throughout the island. The actual model that we followed is being pretty much the same one that we've been following, which is dividing the area of study of the San Juan Bay in estuary system in 2 areas, the upper watershed and the lower watershed, and really strategize the actions based on those underserved communities, the illicit discharges that we were identifying, the public health problems, and the ecological value of the regions. These are some of the results we took from monitoring stations in the upper watershed, since one of the concerns from the community and the government was the contact of these communities, underserved communities, to bacteria, right? Fecal bacteria and leptospira. We conducted a special monitoring protocols and programs to see who and where the communities were, in contact with these bacteria, and quickly communicated that to the Department of Health and also to the community-based organizations that were serving these particular areas that we were sampling. We continue to do that. We are sampling areas that are where the community actually let us know, or where we identify illicit discharges and communicate the results to those in charge. In particular, we have formed a task force composed of the US EPA, the local Environmental Quality Board, the Department of Natural Resources, the Puerto Rico Aqueduct Sewer Authorities, the municipalities, and some community members that are actually part of the water community network. And this here shows the 12 critical areas that we now have identified as areas where we have to, where we feel we need to empower community leaders on water quality monitoring and the effects of being in contact with polluted water, so they can help us manage the next stages, which are the restoration and the reconstruction of this great infrastructure. Moving forward, we have the way we work is actually we identified the environmental justice communities based on the lack of sewage network, those areas that are flood prone, as well as areas where there is a high percentage of people living under the poverty line. These here are just 3 areas that we're currently working. We are managing septic tanks problems, septic systems problems, problems related to power, drinking water, and debris removal still. Some of the strategies we have in place to support these communities, environmental justice communities from the community level, are the ones, it's actually through the San Juan Bay Estuary Program, educational and volunteer-oriented activities. We also conducted a rapid needs assessment, and this was actually a lot of work supported by the Urban Waters program that actually helped us pay for 2 community leaders that really helped us gather information, local information on what the community needs are, how they feel about these whole episodes, and what can we do to help them be better prepared. We also have in place a citizen science certification program that helps these citizens acquire the technical skills that they are so desperately interested in obtaining, so they can be part of the process. From the watershed levels, we needed to put together some broader platforms. And for that, we created a whole new unit called the Community Resilience Unit. The Community Resilience Unit is really one that not only deals with water quality issues, but also deals with public health, access to healthcare, and as well as workforce development. We also put together or formed an urban forest network, and this network is currently composed of green patches already managed by the municipalities, private sector, or the state sector. And our goal is to really strengthen their operations so they can better function, be more efficient, be totally connected, empower them, and then from there develop a green infrastructure master plan that would definitely play a role in the reconstruction process of this region. We are also developing a watershed-based mitigation plan that will be worked and developed from the ground up with the support from the Water Community Network. This watershed-based mitigation plan would hopefully be the first one being approved by FEMA, the first watershed-based mitigation plan being approved by FEMA. So we're crossing our fingers on that. This is just to show you the passport that we develop on for the community to get access to those urban forests that are part of the urban forest network. The Water Community Network, and this next slide is displaying the interconnectivity between climate change, adaptability, and vulnerability, and the resilience that we consider in order for us to develop the activities and projects. It is all interconnected. We're constantly evaluating the adaptation plan that we put together based on what we experienced. We are evaluating the current vulnerability, and for that we will be developing a report that will be developed by our social and natural scientists in Puerto Rico. And of course, considering the threat of climate change, the resilience factor is really, it's really important, and it's playing a key role, as this is the area that is going to help us sustain our work and definitely be able to empower those underserved communities. Some of the tools for resiliency are an Estuario app for citizens and decision makers, and our goal is to improve communication and to obtain data immediately on the exposure of communities to toxic substances or illicit discharges. The citizen science certification program will help them obtain new skills so they can be retrained and hopefully get better jobs to the community. And we have a mapping tool that is really depicting the information, that everything that we're doing on the ground. We actually just formed a community developer corporation, and this is a whole new area that will be developed through the community resilience unit. Last but not least, just want to close with saying that there's a sense of fragility and instability in Puerto Rico. Currently, the governor of Puerto Rico is requesting that Puerto Rico be exempt from certain cost sharing requirements for activities related to debris removal and implementation of emergency protective measures. For us, this is important given that Puerto Rico is undergoing a bankruptcy process, and the cost sharing could be a barrier for us to fully recover. And, you know, from an organization like us that we dedicate our work to water quality restoration, we feel it is important to get together and to work in union to support the work that Governor Rosselló is doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brenda. We really appreciate that. So we're planning to, we're going to go to Tom Herder, and he's going to talk about his work in the Mobile Bay Estuary Program, and then we will take some questions for both of your guys' presentations right after Tom. So if you could hold on, Brenda, I really appreciate it, and Tom, please take it away. Tom, are you still on mute?
How's that?
There we go.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Herder. I'm Watershed Protection Coordinator at the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program, and I'm delighted to stand in front. Yes, ma'am?
Sorry. So at the top, can you just hit the display settings button, and then we'll be able to see your full screen. There we go.
We good?
Perfect.
And you can hear me. All right,
Yes,
I'm delighted to stand in for our director, Roberta Swan, to talk about how we build resilience in partnership with vulnerable communities in the 3 Mile Creek watershed in Mobile. The Mobile Bay NEP is a national program established by the U.S. Congress in 1987 by an amendment to the Clean Water Act. Each of the 28 programs exists in individual states or territories at the specific request of their governors. Mobile Bay was designated an estuary of national significance in 1996 as a result of a comprehensive application by then Governor Bob James. We work with a management conference of federal, state, and local agencies, industry, academia, and citizen groups to develop and implement a comprehensive conservation and management plan based on local input and supporting local priorities that protect water quality, sustain populations of key living resources, manage vital habitats, mitigate human impacts, and build citizen stewardship. Based upon the CCMP, we develop annual work plans to guide activities from one year to the next. We published the 3 Mile Creek Watershed Management Plan in 2014. Public input and engagement were critical to its development, and we hosted close to 20 public meetings and ensured that traditionally underserved minority communities were well represented. This is the 3 Mile Creek Watershed. It drains 30 highly urbanized square miles. Land use is 42% residential, 26% commercial, 17% transportation, and 6% industrial. The remaining undeveloped 9% is predominantly spectacular wetlands in the backyards of historical EJ communities. From west to east, it runs 14 miles across northern Mobile and southern Pritchard through diverse communities that include West Mobile and the University of Alabama, affluent Spring Hill, low to moderate income Crichton, yuppie Midtown, where I live, past economically challenged Toulminville, then further through those undeveloped wooded wetlands behind minority, traditionally underserved, and historic MLK Avenue communities, the campground, and the bottom, before its confluence with Toulmin Springs Branch, and then it continues on through Alabama State Port Authority property before flowing into the Mobile River. This is Greater Mobile with its various 12-digit hubs. Most of the city, or about 95 square miles, drain the Dog River. The 3 Mile Creek watershed is situated across the northern boundaries of municipal Mobile and southern portions of the city of Pritchard. Its watershed management plan serves as a template for later Dog River planning. To develop the plan, the watershed was organized into areas of concern. The upper watershed that includes headwaters, the university, and Spring Hill, the middle watershed that includes Crichton, Midtown, and the hospitals, and the lower watershed in Toulmin Springs Branch subwatershed, where the efforts I'm discussing today were focused. From east to west, there's a dramatic trend of decreasing economic well-being. As is often the case, folks in downstream lower reaches bear the disproportionate brunt of issues including non-point source pollution, sanitary sewer overflows, and flooding. Here's some quick demographic data. The proportion of African Americans increases downstream, and you'll look from the bottom kind of up, from 39% in the upper watershed to 66% in the middle watershed to 72% in the lower watershed. And you'll see the Toulmin Springs Branch subwatershed is 98% African American. Poverty increases correspondingly, with only 15% of upper watershed households living below the poverty line, 26% of middle watershed households, and 32% of lower watershed households. Almost half, 46% of households in Toulmin Springs Branch live below the poverty line. This is a SLOSS model image from the watershed management plan showing expected surge from a Category 3 storm in 2013, not even considering future sea level rise. And it illustrates the vulnerability of underserved communities living in the lower watershed and Toulmin Springs Branch. Climate change is going to affect everyone, but the economically challenged communities in the low-lying areas closest to Mobile Bay are particularly vulnerable. So in addition to hosting highly successful and well-attended cleanup events to build community pride and encourage positive behavior changes related to littering, the Mobile Bay NEP undertook several initiatives to build community resilience in 3 Mile Creek's EJ neighborhoods in the face of climate change, including investigations by Auburn University and our Community Solutions Fellow, culminating in the Pritchard Drainage Study, the Martin Luther King Avenue Leadership Academy, the Tolman Springs Branch Community Adaptation Engagement, and the Coastal Alabama Conservation Corps. Dr. Lateef Kalen's Auburn University team assessed hydrology of the Tolman Springs Branch subwatershed. They ensured subwatershed boundaries were accurate. They located and characterized stormwater outfalls. They installed pressure gauges to record flow and depth and establish a curve. They installed a rain gauge at Pritchard City Hall. They calibrated a stormwater management model and conducted water quality sampling. Maharam Dakua, our Community Solutions Fellow from Bangladesh, assisted Auburn on the hydrologic study. He determined areas of low elevation in the Tolman Springs Branch subwatershed, went in on a bicycle and interviewed residents about problems related to stormwater and flooding. He mapped vulnerable areas of flooding or neglect, and he identified problems including poor maintenance, narrow channels, infrastructure clogged by vegetation and litter, and increased stormwater volumes due to upstream imperviousness. The National Estuary Program funded the Pritchard Drainage Study for the Mobile County Commission. This report made recommendations including LID and increased maintenance to address problems identified by Maharam and Auburn for implementation by the county, municipalities, and others. The Hudson River Foundation funded the next 2 initiatives I'll mention. In 2015, the MLK Avenue Redevelopment Corporation and the NEP partnered to create the MLK Avenue Leadership Academy to train, quote, emerging and reluctant leaders, unquote, living along the Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue or in Tolman Springs Branch neighborhoods and seeking positive community change. 14 participants attended 10 two-hour sessions to learn communication, leadership, and conflict resolution skills and become familiar with the incredible environmental assets located in their backyards. Academy members successfully encouraged the Mobile City Council to formally adopt the 3 Mile Creek Watershed Management Plan. They also recognized the need for area young adults to become more connected with environmental assets and suggested opportunities to combine environmental education with employment opportunities, and I'll get to that a little more later. Also in 2015, the University of South Alabama social work instructor Kim Petway led an effort to engage Tolman Springs Branch residents in community planning to adapt to climate change impacts and build capacity for improving community resilience. Ms. Petway's students canvassed neighborhoods, recruiting and gathering input. They publicized the 3 community meetings we hosted to educate residents about the environment, causes of flooding and water pollution, and how hazards will increase due to the effects of climate change. We invited all the participants to participate in an ideas festival to identify community assets in need of protection, to offer ideas on reducing local flooding, to identify existing resources and skill sets within the community to increase resilience, to explore communities to work with the city and others to increase resilience, and to identify community members willing to help. Finally, in response to suggestions made by Leadership Academy folks, the NEP again partnered with the MLK Avenue Redevelopment Corporation and the Student Conservation Association to secure a grant from NIFWIP to establish the Coastal Alabama Conservation Corps. Our goal was to connect young adults from highly urbanized areas of the city of Mobile and to their surrounding environment through education, conservation training, and employment within the lower 3 Mile Creek watershed. So MLK ARC recruited 10 at-risk African-American young adults from the community. SCA provided 2 experienced team leaders to supervise the Corps crew, who they trained in chainsaw operation and safety, wilderness first aid, CPR, herbicide application, wildland firefighting, canoe and paddling safety. Corps members showed up at work at 8 o'clock, traveled to work areas in rented trucks or canoes, and focused on smaller scale restoration projects recommended by the 3 Mile Creek Watershed Management Plan and the Pritchard Drainage Study. They used herbicide to control invasive plant species in the habitat-rich wooded wetlands and tools to clear stormwater conveyances in low-lying Tolman Springs Branch and the lower watershed. Corps members were paid $10 an hour for a 40-hour work week that included 4 days of watershed management plan implementation and 1 day of professional or technical training and soft skill development. They received health benefits and, as AmeriCorps members, were assured a $2,800 educational allowance at the end of their term. Their uniforms included snake boots. They worked in remote wetlands or overgrown stormwater conveyances where they made new friends and had new experiences. Through a partnership with Coca-Cola, who provided plastic barrels, Conservation Corps installed rain barrels throughout Tolman Springs Branch community after recruiting efforts by another Community Solutions fellow, Joni Jamatral from Malaysia. This LID measure was recommended in the Pritchard Drainage Study. The National Estuary Program has secured 200 more barrels from Coca-Cola, and we are awaiting grant funding to put the young man at Wright to work, supervising 100 more installations across this community. I appreciate your time and attention. If I'm out of time, I'd be happy to answer any questions via email or telephone, but I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tom. You can go ahead and just leave this slide up while we take questions, so folks can, see your contact information. Really appreciate that. So thank you so much for that great presentation. We're going to go ahead and take a few questions. So if folks that are listening have any questions that they want to ask, go ahead and type them in now, and we'll have about 5 minutes to take questions. So the first one I have is for Brenda. And so Brenda, one of the attendees is interested in hearing a little bit more about the Citizen Scientist Certificate Program and how it works.
Hi. Yeah, the Citizen Science Certification Program, it's really a partnership we have with the University of Puerto Rico, the Inter-American University, and also certifications we provide, from our own community centers. So what we do is we provide them with at this moment, with 2 models. One of them is the water quality monitoring module. And then we actually require a certain number of hours for them to get the theoretical information, right? And then we take them to the field, and they have to comply with several hours based on the level of monitoring they are interested and they're helping with. The other one is the habitat evaluation module, and that one is done through bird census, and it's just a module that is not only something that we provide, but we also actually provide this to teachers so they can help us further expand the work we're doing and the empowerment. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's definitely a certification program that we're very happy that that the University of Puerto Rico and the Inter-American University have partnered with us.
Great, thank you so much for expounding on that. And so we're receiving lots of questions. So I want to go back to Tom. Tom, we have a few questions for you. So the first question, they would like to understand what type of support services were provided to the members of the Conservation Corps, specifically the young people. Were they provided with any transportation services or any other type of support?
No, it was such a learning process. It's kind of spun into a multi-million-dollar Nature Conservancy Gulf Corps. But we learned so much, and I think I aged 3 years over 2017. Had 2 back surgeries. The kids came to work on their own, and it was They had to be creative in some cases. They relied upon family members. They teamed up once they got to know each other. But they pretty much got there at 8 o'clock. We had, part of the deal was SCA provided rented trucks, and we had 6 canoes that were rented for the duration, because a lot of the work they did was in remote wooded wetlands. But we rented an office space from Michael Pierce, who's the MLK Art Director, and he provides commercial spaces for people in the EJ neighborhood downtown. But the kids had come. We worked them. They worked amazingly hard. They were all incredibly comfortable with the critters they came to know on a first name basis. And one day a week we kind of dropped what we were doing and we got them ready to move on when we were done with them. But again, they all had health benefits for the duration. We were able to find ACA coverage for one of the young ladies as things were winding down, and we actually put a few of the kids to work when the program concluded.
Thank you so much, Tom. So we're getting a lot of really great questions. We're going to do our best to answer a couple more. So Brenda, related to the citizen science program that you mentioned, there is a listener that's interested to know if there's a curriculum that's available online that they can access.
Yeah, sure. We are actually in the process of finishing the new webpage, but the idea, of course, is to upload all of this material. It's currently in Spanish. That's the only problem, in case they need it in English. But we're more than happy to eventually translate this. It's a very nice tool, and yeah, it is not uploaded yet, but we can send it to you or to Miranda, so you can send it to the rest of those that are interested.
Okay, great. I'm sure there will be lots of listeners that would be able to utilize the Spanish version of that curriculum as well. And so a question for both of you. Folks are interested to hear about the major lessons learned from your projects, and also, where do you see these community programs going in the next 5 years or 10 years? What do you envision? So either one of you can take that.
Go ahead, Brenda. I'll follow you.
So major lessons learned. Of course, we had to, after being faced with this threat on a daily basis, because we do get flood events quite frequent, we just realized that we have to develop a strong network, not just with the communities, but also served as a very compassionate liaison between agencies, governmental agencies, private sector, and those communities that are in vulnerable regions. We feel this is the time to develop that network, and that's why I presented the several platforms we're currently developing, not just platforms that are with the community sector, but also with those that are managing this watershed. We also realized that the investments that the EPA has been doing throughout these 24 years have actually paid out. We are not just supporting a watershed in the metropolitan region, but trying to provide those lessons learned actually to other watershed managers in the entire island, so they can be better prepared in the face of other disasters.
I think in Mobile, our efforts have at least impressed upon us the disparity that the EJ communities face. That when you're worried about eating and heating your house or cooling your house, the environment quickly takes a back seat, and it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of understanding, patience, and stick-to-itiveness to try to elevate the EJ communities, and to get get other communities of privilege to understand the disparity and work to address and reduce it.
Thank you so much. So we got a lot of great questions, but I think that Tom, your last response was actually a really great segue into our final presentation, and we will be able to come back to some questions at the very end. You know, Melissa, she works with the DC government, and she's going to be talking to us about her specific model for inclusive planning that they implemented at the DC government, and I think that really gets, you know, back around to what you're mentioning in terms of long-term engagement and investment. So, Melissa, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Oh, great. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here today to present. So yeah, my presentation is going to be a little bit different than the earlier presentations, just in terms of focus, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process for doing community-driven planning from a project that we did here in the district. I'll spend the first few minutes presenting the model that we used for this community engagement and the pilot and what we did, and then one of the outputs of this program was to come up with a community engagement guide that we could share with others that synthesize some of the lessons learned for best practices in doing this. And the goals of doing community-driven planning is to give typically disenfranchised groups a voice in actually driving the decisions made in their own communities, and also building trust and relationships with those communities so that the government and community can actually work more effectively together, have multi-directional learning, which we really found is beneficial for creating better policies, building legitimacy for policies in the eyes of community, shifting power to the community to be agents of change, and also creating community liaisons. So those are really our goals in this process. So as an introduction to what the process is, I'm actually going to step back a little bit and talk about what DC is doing more generally. So I'm with the Department of Energy and Environment, and we have a number of plans. So Sustainable DC is the umbrella plan, which aims to make DC the healthiest, greenest, and most livable city in the United States. So an ambitious goal, and within that we have a couple of sub-plans. So we have Climate Ready DC, which is the plan that I primarily work on, and that's our plan to adapt to climate change, to address vulnerabilities and impacts related to climate change. And then we have Clean Energy DC, which is our plan to cut emissions dramatically by reimagining the district's energy systems to be cleaner, more efficient, and more resilient. So those were the plans that we were focusing on in this community engagement process, but we specifically narrowed in on one community that's shown here in this box. So what you're seeing here is DC, and in that box is the Watts Branch tributary of the Anacostia River. So in the vulnerability assessment that we did in Climate Ready DC, this was identified as one of the high priority areas where we expect that residents will face disproportionate impacts from climate change because, one, there are a lot of cultural important community assets that are in the floodplain in this community, schools, churches, health centers, etc. And two, this community is one of the more lower income parts of the district. It has, you know, a medium household income that is half of what is seen in the rest of the district. It is also a home to community of colors. It is 92% Black. It is also less educated compared to the rest of the district and has an unemployment rate that is more than double what is seen in the rest of the district. So it's a community that has fewer resources to respond to those impacts of climate change when they do hit that community, and is also dealing with new challenges, specifically around gentrification. As all of DC booms, we're seeing more and more pressure on housing costs across the region. So we were lucky to receive a grant that allowed us to do a year-long community engagement process and test out a new model. And so what this model centered around was a group of residents called the Equity Advisory Group. It was 13 residents that met every month over the process of 7 months and gave feedback on how to implement Climate Ready DC and Clean Energy DC at the neighborhood scale. We specifically aimed to create a group that was representative of the community and included a diversity of perspectives. So we had a high school student to much older residents. We had folks that had never participated in a government process, to folks that were more seasoned and sort of knew how the system works, people who were very new to the community, and people who had lived there all their lives and whose grandparents had lived there and had really seen the community change. And the grant also allowed us to build a pretty robust project team that included a number of different players. So of course we had government, so the Department of Energy and Environment, who is super important to have in the room because they have the power to do the plans. We have the power to implement the recommendations that come out of DOEE, but we also were able to understand that whenever we go into a community engagement process, there's a power imbalance between government and community. So we brought in some resources specifically to support the Equity Advisory Group. So we had a neutral facilitator that helped us figure out how to recruit the Equity Advisory Group, how to prepare meetings, how to put together agendas, and actually led those meetings. And then we also had Georgetown Climate Center, who served as a technical expert and subject matter expert on behalf of the Equity Advisory Group to help them answer any questions. And then we also brought in an evaluator who watched the process, who wasn't involved in the decision making, but participated during meetings, participated during planning calls, and gave us feedback at a midpoint during the project and at the end of the project of how well we were meeting our equity and procedural equity goals. So I won't go into super big detail in terms of what we did during each meeting, but what I'm trying to show here is that it was definitely a process of building capacity of the Equity Advisory Group members and building our own capacity to be more responsive to what they saw as the highest priorities. So we started with, just having a few Equity Advisory Group members officially chosen, and then had the Equity Advisory Group tell us who else needed to be at the table as we rounded out recruitment. And then we really dug into what equity means and created shared understandings of what the high priority issues are in the community. We helped build knowledge around both of the climate plans, and then we're able to move into the recommendation phase during the second half of the process. And so the Equity Advisory Group ended up making recommendations around 3 different topics. So one is creating neighborhood scale resilience hubs, and then the other 2, because jobs are a really important thing for this community, both focused on jobs, so workforce development programs for both adults and for youth, and education opportunities specifically for youth. So now I'll transition to talking about some of the big lessons that we tried to convey in our community engagement guide. And we will send around a link so that you all can have access. You'll be the first people to get access to this because it just went up on the website today. But the community engagement guide runs through basically 8 steps and some best practices around those 8 steps. And these first 4 are just around building the project team and putting the project together, because I think a lot of the equity lessons are in that first phase. So one is that it's never too early to start engaging the community when scoping a project. What you're seeing here is a picture of one of the Equity Advisory Group members leading the project team on a tour of the community before we even started recruiting. And this way, this group was able to really understand and see the community from his perspective and hear his priorities before we went out and tried to find people to become engaged in this process. Another thing is that funding can really be an important way to open doors. So in the district, we're not actually allowed to provide food during community meetings, but because we had a grant that supported this project, we were able to provide that support. We also provided every Equity Advisory Group member a stipend for attending meetings and for doing work between meetings. We provided transportation assistance to meetings. We chose a location that was in their community for all the meetings. And we also provided childcare during meetings as needed. Another one around building the project team is sort of trying to figure out how to balance neutrality with community organizations. So as I mentioned, we brought in a neutral facilitator to run this process, but one of the lessons that we learned is that we also really would have benefited from having a community-based organization as a direct partner who could have helped us with recruiting, who already had those relationships, who could have added some legitimacy to the project, so we had to spend less time explaining what we were trying to do. And then when you're actually forming the committee, like the Equity Advisory Group, it's an opportunity to really think about what representation means in the context of your project. So what are you trying to accomplish? We really knew that we were trying to bring in voices who weren't typically at the table. So we skewed a little bit younger because those are groups that are harder to engage. We also know that in DC, race and equity are really linked, and so that we really wanted to be conscious about thinking about that during recruiting. So the next 4 steps are about creating that meeting structure and getting to recommendations. And so some of the lessons learned here are that when you're creating your meeting structure and putting together those meetings, one of the things that we really learned early on is that presentations just ate up so much time and weren't really as effective as doing engaging activities with this group. Even when we presented information that was really important for everybody to know, we found that it kind of went over people's heads unless we had real deep conversations about it, or actually allowed a committee member to step into the role of expert, or had small group discussions, and that we really needed to spend more time listening and learning from people, and that was the goal of this engagement process. When you're actually developing recommendations, one of the big lessons was that you need to create a big tent in terms of who you're bringing in to the process. So one of the lessons that we learned is, as the Equity Advisory Group determined what areas they wanted to develop these recommendations, they could use support from nonprofit partners, from other agency staff members, from other district agencies other than the Department of Energy and Environment, from the private sector. And these people came in not to present again and tell them how to develop recommendations, but as a sounding board. So they answered questions and they listened and they provided feedback as ideas were floated around. So we also learned that you have to share the recommendations with others. So the Equity Advisory Group was 13 people, as I mentioned. If you assume that 13 people are truly going to be representative of an entire community, that would be tokenism and just simply isn't correct. So we had to create a public meeting opportunity for the Equity Advisory Group to go out and tell other people what they were thinking and get feedback from others on their plan. And it was actually an incredibly powerful public meeting because the Department of Energy and Environment and our other project partners didn't do the presentation. The Equity Advisory Group did all of the presentation, and we're able to have those conversations with their own community members, and we found that the community was really receptive to what they had to say. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is just the importance of remaining accountable. All will be lost if we're not able to actually act on the feedback that we got during this process. And so the challenge for the next year and onward will be to start taking some of these recommendations and actually moving on them, and that we also had to create channels to keep relationships with the Equity Advisory Group alive. So we have quarterly calls with them and are continuing to find ways to engage with that group. So I will leave it there, but here is all of my contact information, and I look forward to the conversation and the questions.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa. So we already have a question for you. One of the attendees is interested to understand sort of where the grant funding came for this activity for the Equity Advisory Group.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was funded through a grant called Partners for Places, and it was an equity pilot initiative. So that's partially through the funders network, and then it had a match through 2 local foundations, the Prince Charitable Trust and the Morris and Gwendolyn Case Fritz Foundation.
Great, thank you. And that also kind of jogs my memory because, Tom, during your presentation, you mentioned the NIFWIS grant, but just for folks who actually don't know what the acronym means, can you explain what the NIFWIS grant is?
Yeah, we've become real familiar with NIFWF because it's the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and they're grantors that manage money to provide funding for projects. And this was from a funding source called Creating a New Generation of Conservationists. And they have offerings each year, I believe. NIFWF is the administrator of the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund, which handles the criminal penalties from the Deepwater Horizon also.
Great, thank you so much. So if folks have additional questions, let's see, I think we just got one. Okay, so going back to Melissa, so we're still getting questions, so thank you so much. So going back to Melissa's presentation, one of the attendees wants to ask, what's the main way of conveying information at these meetings through activities? How do you share information? Oh, sorry. Was it done in advance?
So we had homework and assignments between each meeting where we asked Equity Advisory Group members to engage in some of the topic, maybe to read parts of the plans, or one of the really successful homework activities we ask people to do is to talk to a community elder or neighbor about how they experience disasters and get another person's perspective on that. So that was one way of engaging, and then we could use whatever they learned during that process during the meetings for more discussions. Another activity that we did during the first meeting was to create a timeline of policies in the community that impacted equity and how the community was seeing investment and environmental justice issues, and we co-created that. So we had everybody sort of brainstorm and think through, and we built out the timeline during the meeting, and that was a really great place to sort of ground the conversation and create a shared understanding of the history of the community. So things like that were really engaging and worked really well.
Awesome. So I want to kind of circle back to Brenda because we had some other questions from the previous round. So Brenda, one of the audience members was curious to know how adaptation plans were put in place before the natural disaster, and wondering how efficient and adequate these planning process, the adaptation plans were, and any lessons learned or things that could have been done differently.
Hi. Yes, we follow the risk management protocol in which we evaluated with the community what their vulnerability, how they feel about the vulnerabilities of their surroundings. We gather information regarding different adaptations, and then we put together a couple of pilot projects. Projects that will be easy for the community to embrace and cost efficient as well. I would say that some of those were directly applied right after the hurricane, and you kind of have to understand that right after the hurricane, I mean no power, no one was being able to communicate with no one, right? So this was me with one additional intern that happened to be my neighbor, putting together, right, the relief platform and trying to make sense. But in reality, our main concern was the contact of these people to polluted waters, because people were not really understanding the level of threat they were being exposed to. And after Maria, we of course have several environmental justice communities we've worked throughout this past 24 years. But after Maria, everyone was at risk in Puerto Rico. No one had access to clean water. No one had electricity. So in a way, we had to provide support to everyone the best way we could. The more time, the more power we started to get, access to gas, we were then able to move across the island. So it's pretty accurate, the adaptation plan, I would say, to what we have, and I'm actually surprised at that. But you know, I'm glad we went through that, because the community really knew what we were talking about. But we're still evaluating what we have in place, just to make sure that is absolutely the most, the most relevant plan we could have for future events.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for answering that question. So we're still getting questions coming in. We're getting close to the end of our time, but Melissa, we had a few more questions for you. In particular, one of the audience members was interested in hearing about if any specific recommendations that came as a result of your planning process, if you're comfortable with sharing.
So some of the recommendations from the Equity Advisory Group, so as I mentioned before, they were really interested in creating and making sure that as the district is investing in clean energy and in resilience, that it's creating jobs. So some of the specific recommendations were to make sure that with everything that we're looking at, we're thinking about whether it can create a job opportunity for people in this area, and that we're putting resources towards those job programs, and starting with elementary students in terms of education, and then by high school getting students on a pathway towards certificates that are nationally recognized and not just locally recognized. That was a big piece of feedback, that they don't want just local programs, they want us to create opportunities everywhere. And then resilience hubs, which I don't know if folks are familiar with those, but they're physical spaces that are trusted and recognized by the communities they serve, to provide emergency information during and after an emergency event, but when it's not an emergency event, also provide other community resources. So it might actually be a job training center, or it might be providing other community needs. And so they outlined exactly what they saw a community resilience hub would look like in the context of their own community, and provided some really great feedback around that.
Thanks, Melissa. So we're continuing to get questions. Another one for you. A couple people were interested to learn a little bit more about your outreach process to reach the community members that were a part of the Equity Advisory Group, and then also how did you keep them engaged in the process, especially when there aren't always intermediate deliverables?
Yeah, so I think in terms of recruiting folks, the best feedback I can give is just do some strategic hanging out in the community, actually start to get to know the community, go to where the community already gathers. So what was most effective was going to local citizen group meetings, and talking to folks about this project and kind of getting a sense of whether they wanted to be involved, and then also talking to other people who are involved in the project and making sure that we were getting their recommendations on who might we not be reaching, how can we get them involved, and getting names and phone numbers and actually just reaching out directly. And then in terms of keeping people engaged throughout the process, I think once we started getting people's trust and getting their buy-in, it actually didn't end up being that difficult to get people to come. We, had a meeting where actually everybody showed up, which is basically impossible in community organizing. But we generally had really high attendance at all of our community meetings. I think it also helps that people had a stipend. So there was some monetary incentive to go, but I don't think the stipend was enough to make sure somebody went to a meeting. It was really that they were committed and bought into what they were trying to do.
Thank you. And so I think this will be the last question. I think it can, we probably would be great to hear from all three of you, because the question has to do with how do you effectively communicate these technical topics, specifically climate, watershed issues, flooding. Sometimes the folks that we want to engage, it can be, we can kind of be speaking in jargon, and it can be a challenge to communicate. And so, what tips do you have for doing a better job translating these technical topics? So I guess we could start with Melissa, but I think probably Tom and Brenda also would have some good strategies for that as well.
Yeah, I think around climate, we found that having maps really was something that just brought people alive, just seeing their community, seeing whether their house was in the floodplain or not, really connecting to things that people resonate. When I talk about heat, I often talk about the heat island as being similar to being in a car that's left out in the sun and just how much warmer it gets than the outside. So finding things that resonate with folks, but also I think it was listening, listening that jobs and economic development and safety were all concerns that exist in the community, and thinking through before you go into these meetings, if I know that, how can I reframe environmental issues in the context of all of those things so that I'm actually speaking to people about issues that they care about really deeply in addition to environmental issues.
Thank you. Tom or Brenda, did you guys have any thoughts on the question about sort of communicating topics with people that are not necessarily trained in this specific area?
It's a challenge, and if we had been more successful, if I felt like we had just done a bang up job of this, then I might have something more to offer. We tone it down. We don't go in there with walk speak or jargon speak. We try to, and in Mobile, Alabama, climate change impacts happen in real time. We're seeing it. So we can talk about April of 2014 and the rains, the 23 inches of rain we got in a day. We can talk about specific examples at any time from within the last 6 months. So we go there, and we know our audience, and we're working on it. I think we have work to do, and we still need to learn. But I was a coach my whole adult life till I got my job at 51. I think they hired me because I can talk to people that aren't scientists. But it's challenging. It's challenging.
So, this is me, Brenda. Of course, I definitely think that maps is really a very powerful tool. And the reason why I mentioned that we have this atlas that will be integrated into our webpage, but we are also going, out of the box. We just created the Artist in Residence program that will be working in close collaboration and coordination with the community resilience coordinators we have that are working directly with the communities and community-based organizations. So that Artist in Residence program is really a way for us to engage the community and translate the information into a very cultural competent way of engaging them and further making an impact.
Can I add one thing we did with the Conservation Corps, who were, they were all 19 to 26-year-old African-American young adults. We prepared a Watersheds 101 video that they took to the schools, to the sixth graders, because we thought they were an outstandingly credible messengers. And I think that was something we did right, and it worked. And I think finding credible messengers is a heck of a tool.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate all your thoughts on that, and those specific types of approaches and strategies I think are really helpful for people to think through what will work in their specific context. And so we're just right at 2:30, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, everybody that submitted questions. We apologize that we weren't able to answer every single one, but we really appreciate your participation and engagement. And so just to wrap up, I just wanted to point to some interesting resources and tools that are available. All the links are here. There was a question earlier that was asking about specific indicators for climate adaptation and climate justice in particular. And so you can find I'll just point to the specific report, Evaluating Urban Resilience to Climate Change, a Multi-Sector Approach. It kind of goes through some some ideas for qualitative and quantitative indicators. So that's a really interesting report. The Georgetown Climate Adaptation Center also has a lot of really great, and Melissa came from the Georgetown actually, and has a lot of really, really great resources and tools, specifically the Adaptation Clearinghouse. So I really encourage anybody to just go ahead and go on there, and everything's publicly available. And we can just go to the next slide. As well, I'll just point out our EJ Screen tool, which is our environmental justice screening and mapping tool. It's a GIS tool that can help folks try to understand kind of what are the challenges in different communities where they live. And the last thing I want to point out is that we're going to be releasing our EJ Small Grants RFP this month. And so we do have a focus area in resilience this year. And so, you know, these are small grants. They're about $30,000, but they can be used for planning. They can be used for demonstration projects. And so, you know, it's a small grant, and we really try to use this to kind of build capacity of smaller organizations if we can, but we just want to kind of get the word out that RFP is going to be coming out, and that's a great resource. And with that, I'll turn it back to Miranda.
Great, thanks, Janine. I just want to put a plug in for Watershed Academy. We are currently planning our next webcast and hope that you'll visit our website in the coming weeks as we post additional details on the topic, speakers, how to register, etc. So check back. Thank you all. I'd like to conclude today's webcast, but amazing speakers, and thanks to all of our participants who joined. And talk to you again soon.